The fence line hadn't moved in 60 years, but the man standing at it in October of 2026 had. He rested his forearms on the top wire the way his father used to, weight settled into his boot heels, eyes fixed on the low 40 like it owed him an explanation. 3 harvests had passed since the day the mud told its story, and still, when the wind came up cool and the beans started rattling dry in their pods, his mind went back to the same frame of memory, over and over, like a photograph left too long in a shirt pocket. It wasn't the tractor he'd built that came to him first. It was the other one, the one that wasn't his. 2 years before, on a gray afternoon heavy with the smell of turned earth and diesel exhaust, he'd stood in almost this exact spot and watched a brand new John Deere 8R series demo unit go down to its axles in that same black gumbo soil, its dual rear tires spinning uselessly, flinging mud 30 feet in ropes that slapped against the cab glass. The dealership had brought it out to show what real horsepower looked like in a wet bottomland field, a show of confidence, a quiet rebuke, though nobody had said as much out loud. It hadn't needed saying. 2 men in creased khakis had climbed down from the cab and stood ankle-deep in the muck, staring at a $310,000 machine that wasn't going anywhere without a tow chain and a prayer. He hadn't laughed. That wasn't in him. Not about a stuck tractor, not about any man's bad luck in a field that had swallowed better implements than that one over the decades. But something had settled into his chest that afternoon, quiet and unshakable, the kind of certainty that comes only to men who've spent their whole lives reading ground the way other people read weather reports. He'd looked at that demo unit buried past its fenders, and looked at the sky, and thought about a rig sitting behind his pole barn that everyone in 3 counties had told him was a joke. He didn't say any of this quickly. He never did. He let the silence stretch the way his father used to before answering a question that mattered, working a thumbnail along the fence wire, letting the wind do some of the talking. Behind him, past the tree line, an old Massey Ferguson green glinted dully under a lean-to roof he'd built himself the same autumn his father died. Parts of it long gone into another machine entirely now, though the memory of the original still sat there like scripture. "Everybody remembers the field," he said finally, not looking at whoever stood beside him to hear it. "Nobody remembers what came 2 days after." He turned from the fence, boots sinking slightly into the same soil that had swallowed a $310,000 tractor whole, and began walking the tree line toward the pole barn, toward the story that still didn't sit easy with half the county, even now. The pole barn smelled of diesel and cold iron, the way it always had, the way it probably always would as long as he kept farming this ground. He walked the length of it slowly, past the bench his father built in 1981 out of oil-field pipe and 2x8s, past a wall of tools hung by outline like a museum display nobody had ever thought to admire. 640 acres waited beyond those walls, the same 640 his father had worked for 38 years before the heart attack took him in a soybean field in the spring of 2019, 3 weeks shy of what would have been his 59th spring on that same dirt. The ground didn't care whose name was on the deed, it only cared whether you showed up when it demanded something of you, and his father had shown up for 38 years running, through drought and flood and 2 divorces that weren't his own, but nearly broke him anyway, helping neighbors through theirs. The Massey Ferguson 3505 had come into the family in 1994, bought used for $14,000 from an implement dealer 2 counties over, who'd taken it in trade from a widow liquidating her husband's equipment line. His father had driven it home himself, 60-some miles on back roads at 18 miles an hour, because he didn't trust the transport company not to scratch the paint on something he'd just spent a season's wheat check on. That tractor had disked, planted and cultivated this ground for the better part of 2.5 decades before newer iron took over the heavier work, relegated afterward to bush hogging and grain cart duty, the kind of machine a family keeps not because it's efficient, but because retiring it feels like betrayal. He remembered his father's hands on that steering wheel more clearly than he remembered the man's face some days, thick-knuckled, permanently stained at the cuticles, moving with the unconscious economy of someone who'd logged more hours in that seat than in his own bed. The Perkins six-cylinder under that hood had never once left him stranded in a field, not through hail, not through the flash floods of '07, not through the brutal winter starts when the mercury dropped past zero and every other diesel on the place refused to turn over. His father used to say the engine ran on stubbornness as much as fuel, and for years that had sounded like sentiment rather than mechanical fact. By the time his father died, the 3505 sat mostly idle, its transmission worn soft, its sheet metal rusted through in patches, but that engine, that Perkins block his father, had changed the oil on every 100 hours without fail for 25 years, logged in a spiral notebook now sitting in a kitchen drawer. That engine still turned over on the first crank. It was, though nobody in the county would have guessed it standing in that pole barn in the fall of 2021, about to become the most valuable asset his father ever left behind. The storm that took the 8245R came through on a Tuesday evening in June, the kind of sky that farmers in that county learned to read the way sailors read water. A green-gray bruise low on the horizon, the air gone still and thick in that particular way that meant something was coming. He'd gotten the tractor under the lean-to on the north side of the grain bin complex, figuring that was shelter enough, the way it had been shelter enough for 11 years. It wasn't. The hail came first, marble-sized, then golf ball-sized, hammering the cab glass into a spider web of white fractures, stripping paint off the hood in patches the size of dinner plates. Then the wind took the grain bin itself, the older one, the 1978 model his father had put up with a hired crew the summer before he was born, and folded its corrugated steel walls inward like a tin can crushed underfoot. 2,000 bushels of wheat, and half the bin's structure, came down across the lean-to, across the tractor, across 11 years of payments, and a decade of fieldwork logged in hours that read, at the time of the collapse, just under 6,200. The adjuster came out that Thursday, and the dealership sent its own man the following Monday, and both of them walked the wreckage with the particular grim efficiency of men who had seen this exact scenario before and already knew, before they'd finished walking it, what the number was going to be. The engine block was cracked in 2 places. The wiring harness had been crushed and shorted by falling grain bin steel, then soaked through by 3 days of intermittent rain before anyone could get a tarp over it. The dealership's estimate came back on letterhead 8 days later, $71,400 to replace the engine and the harness, parts and labor, John Deere OEM components only, no aftermarket substitutions covered under the extended warranty terms that, as it turned out, expired the previous November, a detail the service manager mentioned almost as an aside, the way a man mentions something he already knows will end the conversation. $71,400. He said the number out loud once, standing in his kitchen with the estimate sheet in his hand, and his wife had gone quiet in a way that scared him more than shouting would have. They didn't have it. Not liquid, not without touching the account they'd built for their son's tuition, not without remortgaging ground that had been paid off since 2015. The dealership, for its part, didn't wait long for an answer. 3 weeks after the estimate, they declared the 8245R a total loss, informed him the insurance settlement would cover a fraction of a replacement, and moved the wrecked shell to their salvage lot, where it sat between a burned combine and a rolled-over sprayer, waiting for a number to be chalked on its cracked windshield. The salvage auction fell on a Saturday morning in August, the kind of dry heat that makes the gravel lot shimmer and the auctioneer's voice carry farther than it should. Standing at the fence line 3 harvests later, he'd remember that morning the way a man remembers a funeral he almost didn't attend. The folding chairs set up in rows that nobody used, the coffee gone cold in styrofoam cups, the way the shell sat there under a temporary tarp somebody had thrown over the cracked windshield like it was ashamed of itself. Lot 14. That's what the number chalked on the glass said, right below where Hale had spiderwebbed the safety glass into a pattern he'd later compare to a river system seen from the air. He hadn't told his wife he was going. That was the part he never said out loud to anyone but himself. Not for years. Not until he was standing at this same fence line, telling it to someone who hadn't lived through it. She'd said no the week before, flat and final. The tuition account was for their son, not for a dead tractor, and he'd nodded like a man agreeing, and then he'd driven 40 minutes to the salvage lot with a cashier's check folded in his shirt pocket that he'd had made out that same morning before she was awake. The bidding didn't last long. Nobody wanted a totaled 8245R shell with a blown engine and a harness the dealership itself had called unsalvageable. Nobody but a man who'd spent 14 months already turning the problem over in his head without admitting to himself that's what he was doing. $9,200. The gavel came down before he'd fully exhaled, and the auctioneer barely looked up from his sheet, already moving on to the burned combine 2 lots over, like what had just happened wasn't a decision that would follow a family for years. He didn't celebrate. He remembered standing there with the receipt in his hand, watching the salvage crew hook a chain to the shell and drag it onto his trailer, and feeling less like a man who'd won something and more like a man who'd just signed something he couldn't take back. Driving home with that dead green hulk swaying behind his truck, he rehearsed what he'd say to her, and none of it sounded like enough. She was on the porch when he pulled in. She didn't come down the steps right away. She just stood there looking at the shell on the trailer, at the cracked glass, at the hail-dented hood, and he watched her do the math the way he had. The tuition money gone, the ground unmortgaged but the cushion gone with it. And for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the whole weight of it sitting between them in the yard, like a debt that hadn't been named yet. Word got around before the shell even had a chance to cool in the pole barn. That was how it worked in a county that small. A man couldn't buy a wrecked tractor at a salvage auction for $9,200 without 3 people at the co-op elevator knowing the exact figure by the next morning, and knowing, too, what he meant to do with it. He hadn't hidden his plan. He'd never been a man who hid things. So when he mentioned it, plainly, to the parts counter clerk while asking about transmission fluid specs for an 8245R, the words traveled through the dealership like current through wet wire. And by the following Tuesday, the service manager himself was standing in the doorway of the shop, arms crossed, saying it to his face instead of behind it, which he supposed later was the only decent thing about the whole exchange. "You're going to put a Perkins in a Deere," the service manager said, not as a question. He said it the way a man might say, "You're going to burn down your own barn," like the mechanics of the thing offended him less than the principle of it. He talked about warranty voids that didn't exist because there was no warranty left to void, about wiring harnesses that wouldn't recognize a foreign block, about torque curves and bell housing bolt patterns as though reciting scripture at a man he'd already judged. He called it, more than once, a liability waiting to happen, and he said it in front of 2 other men in dealership polos who nodded like a jury already returned. The coffee shop was worse in its own quieter way, because it wasn't official, it was just the truth of what people believed dressed up as concern. Men who'd farmed 40 years themselves, men who'd bought green their whole lives because their fathers had, sat over eggs and black coffee and called it heresy without ever using that word, calling it instead a shame, a waste, a good tractor's grave getting robbed for parts that didn't belong in it. One of them said his father wouldn't have wanted his engine humiliated that way, put to work in a shell it was never built for, and that one landed harder than anything the service manager said, because it came dressed as respect for the dead instead of contempt for the living. He didn't argue with any of it. He'd learned young that arguing with a room already decided was a waste of breath better spent elsewhere, and besides, some small, stubborn part of him understood why they said it. A Massey engine and a Deere frame was not a marriage anybody blessed in that county, not in memory, not in practice. But he carried the mockery home the way he carried diesel fuel, necessary and foul-smelling, and he set it down in the pole barn next to the shell and the dead tractor waiting behind the house, and he started, that same week, pulling bolts he had no guarantee would ever go back together right. The Massey had sat behind the house since the funeral, under a blue poly tarp that had gone brittle and gray at its folds, and when he pulled that tarp back in September of 2021, it made a sound like tearing paper, and something in his chest tore along with it. The 3505 hadn't turned over in 2 years. Its tires had sunk half an inch into the dirt where it stood, and mud dauber nests had colonized the wheel wells, and a family of barn cats had raised at least one litter in the cab. But the engine itself, the 6-cylinder Perkins his father had babied through 27 years, and God knew how many thousand hours of tillage and hay work, that engine, when he finally got the valve cover off, looked as clean inside as the day the machine rolled off a Enid dealer's lot in 1994 for $14,000 his father had scraped together from a bad soybean year and a worse wheat year and a bank loan he paid off 11 months early out of pure stubborn pride. He did not attack the tractor. That was the word he kept coming back to afterward, when people asked how he'd done it. He did not attack it, he approached it, the way you'd approach a body you were asked to prepare for burial, with a kind of ceremonial slowness that had nothing to do with mechanical necessity and everything to do with what the machine had been. He drained the fluids into clean buckets and labeled them by date and system, out of habit more than need. He photographed every bolt pattern before he broke it loose, not trusting memory with something this permanent. He kept a yellow legal pad on the workbench and wrote down torque specs from the shop manual his father had annotated in pencil 3 decades before, and more than once he found himself reading his father's handwriting instead of the printed text beside it, some cryptic note, like tightened by feel, not gauge, gauge lies in cold weather, that told him more about the man than any obituary had. The engine came out over 4 evenings in late September, hoisted a 1/4 inch at a time on a chain hoist bolted to a rafter he'd reinforced himself the week before, sweating through October cool nights, with a drop light clamped to the tractor's skeleton and his breath fogging in front of his face. When the block finally cleared the frame rails and hung there swinging slightly on the chain, 600-some pounds of iron and history, he stood underneath it longer than the job required, one hand flat against the oil pan the way you'd rest a hand on a casket, and told himself this wasn't sentiment, this was inventory, this was making sure nothing had cracked in the lift. But his wife, watching from the barn door with her arms crossed against the cold, would say later she'd never seen a man look so much like he was attending 2 funerals at once. The bell housing was where the whole plan could have died a quiet death in a pole barn outside the county seat, and everyone who knew enough about tractors to have an opinion knew it. A Perkins 6 out of a 1987 Massey Ferguson 3505 was never meant to speak to a Deere transmission out of a 2011 8245R. The bolt patterns belonged to two different conversations entirely, engineered 40 years and two continents apart by men who never once considered the other's existence. The shell's original bell housing was scrap, warped in the same hailstorm that took the wiring harness, and no aftermarket adapter existed for a marriage nobody sane had proposed. This was the linchpin, and he knew it the way you know the one bolt in an engine that if it strips, the whole job stops. He called the old welder on a Tuesday night in early November, not because the man advertised himself as a machinist. He'd retired 11 years back from a shop that mostly did truck frames and cattle guards, but because he'd watched him true up a bent axle housing once with nothing but a chalk line, a torch, and 40 years of not being wrong twice about the same mistake. The old welder came out to the pole barn 2 days later, walked around the engine still hanging half-mounted on a temporary stand, and didn't say much of anything for the better part of 20 minutes, just crouched and measured and crouched again, running a caliper over bolt spacing on both housings like he was reading a language only his hands understood. What he proposed, eventually, standing up with his knees cracking in the cold, was a plate, quarter-inch steel, cut to bridge the Perkins bolt pattern on one face and the Deere transmissions on the other, with a register bore machined dead center to keep the crankshaft and input shaft running true within a few thousandths, because if that alignment wandered even a little under load, it would eat the pilot bearing in a season and take the transmission's front seal down with it. There was no template for this. The old welder drew it freehand on a scrap of cardboard first, then transferred it to steel, cutting and test-fitting and grinding and test-fitting again across 11 evenings that November, refusing payment beyond diesel money and coffee, saying only that he'd rather do it right, the slow way, than do it twice. By the time the plate sat true on the bench, bolt holes drilled and countersunk, register bore polished to a mirror, it looked less like an adapter and more like a piece of surgical instrumentation, the kind of thing that shouldn't exist outside a manufacturer's parts catalog. He held it up to the shop light, turning it slow, and understood for the first time that the whole rebuild now rested on this single piece of hand-cut steel doing something no engineer at either company had ever intended it to do. The wiring came next, and it proved slower than the steel. The Deere's harness had never been built to speak to a Perkins block wearing a mechanical injection pump instead of the electronic common rail system the 8245R's computer expected to see, so entire sections of that harness became useless. Miles of orange and gray sheathing coiled off into a scrap barrel behind the pole barn, replaced instead with a simplified loom he built himself, tracing each wire by hand against a wiring diagram photocopied so many times at the county library that the toner had gone soft and gray at the edges. He kept a ledger through all of it, a cracked vinyl 3-ring binder that had once held his father's own service records, and into its back half he began writing his own. Torque specs for the bell housing bolts, cross-referenced twice against two different Massey manuals because the numbers in one didn't quite match the other. Fitment trials for the fan shroud, which had to be trimmed by 1.5 inches before it would clear the Perkins' taller valve cover. Notes in blue ballpoint about which grade of hydraulic fluid the Deere's hitch pump would tolerate once it was running off a drive gear never designed to spin at the Perkins' particular idle speed. Some nights the entries were only a sentence. Rerouted glow plug relay, tested cold start, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, fired on second try, and some nights they ran half a page, arguments with himself in ink about whether to trust the Massey's oil cooler routing or fabricate new lines to match the Deere's radiator geometry, arguments he'd usually resolve by falling asleep at the workbench and waking up cold with the answer already decided somewhere in the back of his skull. His wife brought supper out to the barn more nights than either of them wanted to count, setting the plate on the workbench without a word, watching him wipe his hands on a rag gone permanently black before he'd eat, and though she'd stopped arguing about the money by that second winter, she hadn't stopped worrying, and he could see it in the way she'd linger in the doorway a moment too long before going back to the house. By March, the fluid systems were sorted, the harness tested circuit by circuit with a cheap multimeter he'd bought secondhand at a farm sale for $6, and by June, the engine turned over on its own compression for the first time, coughing blue smoke into the rafters before settling into a rough, uneven idle that made the whole barn smell like his father's shop had smelled 30 years earlier. He didn't call it finished. Not yet. There were still hydraulic lines to press, a fuel system to bleed properly, a transmission to fill and check twice against the manual specifications, and 100 small fitment questions that wouldn't answer themselves until the tractor was asked to do actual work under actual load, something the ledger's pages, however carefully kept, could never fully predict. By the time October 2023 rolled around, the Low 40 had earned its name twice over, first for its acreage, second for the way it sat lower than every other parcel he farmed, a natural catch basin for whatever the sky decided to dump on that stretch of bottomland. That fall it had rained 11 inches in 18 days, the kind of soaking that turned the topsoil to something closer to batter than ground, and every farmer within 20 miles of the county seat knew better than to run anything heavier than a four-wheeler through it without asking for trouble. The dealership didn't ask anyone. 2 days before he took the hybrid tractor into that field, the dealership's brand-new 8R Series demo unit, the same model his wrecked 8245R Shell had once belonged to, only newer, glossier, still smelling of factory paint, went in to run a promotional pull for a handful of prospective buyers the service manager had invited out to see what real horsepower could do in real conditions. It didn't do much. Within 30 yards of the gate, the demo tractor's rear tires broke through the crust and kept going, sinking past the lugs, past the rims, until the axles themselves were kissing mud and the whole 18-ton machine sat canted at an angle that made the onlookers stop laughing about anything at all. It took a tow truck, a second tractor with a chain rated well past what the situation should have required, and the better part of 4 hours to drag it free, gouging 2 ruts through the Low 40 that would still be visible come spring planting. Word of it moved through the co-op elevator before the mud had even dried on the demo unit's undercarriage. Not gloating exactly, not yet, but the particular hush that settles over a coffee shop crowd when something expensive and confident has just been humbled by ground everybody local already respected. He heard about it secondhand from a neighbor who'd been standing at the fence that day, and he didn't say much in response, just nodded the way a man nods when a fact confirms something he'd already suspected about the difference between a machine built for a brochure and a machine built for a place. He didn't plan the timing. The soybeans were ready regardless of what had happened to the dealership's demo, and the Low 40 needed harvesting same as every other field on the 640 acres, mud or no mud, audience or no audience. But when he backed the loaded grain cart up to the hybrid tractor's drawbar 2 mornings later, he understood, standing there in the gray early light, that whatever happened next in that same soaked ground wouldn't just be about getting a crop out before the next rain came. He climbed into the cab the way he'd climbed into it every harvest morning for the past year, no ceremony to it, though his hand lingered half a second longer than usual on the wheel his father had gripped for 38 seasons before him. The Perkins caught on the second turn of the key, the way it always did, a low 6-cylinder shudder settling into the same steady idle the old man used to say you could set a clock by. 900 bushels sat behind him in the cart, the axles already pressed low into their springs. More weight than the low 40 had ever been asked to move through standing water and gumbo clay that hadn't seen real sun in 4 days. He eased into the field the way you ease into cold water, not because the tractor hesitated, but because he did, some old instinct telling him to respect ground that had already claimed a $340,000 machine 2 days prior. The front tires found the same soft shoulder the demo unit had found, and for a moment the whole frame settled, sank, held, and he felt the torque come up through the drawbar the way he'd felt it 100 times on paper in his head during the 14 months he'd spent bent over that engine bay, wondering if the numbers he'd worked out on the back of a feed receipt would hold up against real mud, real weight, real consequence. They held. The Massey's diesel didn't scream for it. It just leaned into the load the way it had leaned into loads on this same ground since 1994, torque arriving low and patient instead of chasing revolutions the way the newer engines were tuned to do. And the bell housing adapter the old welder had shaped by hand, grinding, test-fitting, grinding again, 3 separate times before the tolerances satisfied him, carried that torque through to the Deere's transmission without so much as a shudder betraying the union between 2 machines that had never been designed to know each other. The tires spun once, caught, spun again in a wetter patch near the field's center, and then bit down into firmer ground beneath the surface slop, ground the demo tractor's shorter wheelbase and heavier front end had never reached. He kept the throttle steady, resisting the urge to push it, because his father had taught him that panic under load was how a man broke something expensive trying to save something cheap. The cart came through behind him, rocking once through a rut, then leveling, then trailing a wake of black water across ground that had swallowed brand-new steel just 48 hours before. And he crossed the far fence line of the low 40 with the engine temperature holding exactly where it should, the adapter plate silent, the whole assembly behaving like something that had always belonged together. By the time he'd cut the engine and climbed down to check the hitch pins, 3 men from a neighboring operation had already parked their trucks along the section road, drawn by nothing more than the sight of a loaded grain cart moving where nothing was supposed to move that week. They didn't say much. One of them walked the tire tracks the way a man might walk a crime scene, studying the depth of the ruts where the hybrid had powered through versus the churned, abandoned gouges 40 yards east where the demo tractor had been winched out 2 days prior. He didn't need to explain anything. The ground did the talking, and ground doesn't lie the way a service counter can. By that evening, the story had reached the co-op elevator, passed along by men who'd watched it happen, and men who hadn't but repeated it anyway, with the confidence of eyewitnesses. By the next morning, it was sitting at the coffee shop table downtown, worked over by the same crowd that 18 months earlier had called the whole rebuild a fool's errand, a Massey heart stitched into a deer's chest, bound for a ditch or a fire. Now they turned the story over like a coin they weren't sure was counterfeit, and found, to their visible discomfort, that it rang true every time they flipped it. Word moves fast in a county that small, and it moves faster when it embarrasses somebody with a name on a building. The dealership heard it within the week, not through any official channel, but through a parts counter conversation that reached the wrong ears, or the right ones, depending on how you looked at it. And so it was the service manager himself who pulled his truck up the gravel drive on a gray Thursday afternoon in late October, hat in hand, in the way men do when they've come to ask for something rather than sell it. He hadn't come to gloat, and to his credit, he didn't try to disguise that he'd come to learn. He wanted to see the adapter plate up close, wanted measurements, wanted to know how the old welder had solved the spline mismatch that Deere's own engineers would have called impossible without a 5-figure custom casting. He was asking, plainly, for permission to document the whole swap for a training bulletin, something the regional office could show younger technicians who'd never think past the parts catalog. And when Whalen told him the price of that permission, that his father's tractor be named, its serial number recorded, its story told alongside the metal, the service manager didn't hesitate before agreeing, pen already out, notebook already open to a blank page waiting to be filled with something the dealership had never expected to write down. That was 3 harvests ago now, and the man standing at the fence line of the low 40 tells it the way you'd tell a story about a funeral that turned, halfway through, into something like a wedding. Grief and vindication braided so tight you can't pull one thread without the other coming loose. He doesn't gesture much when he talks. He doesn't need to. Behind him, parked at the edge of the field with mud still crusted in the tread from that morning's pass, sits the tractor itself. Green sheet metal faded now, a few more dents than the storm gave it, the Perkins diesel under the hood still turning over on the first crank, the way it did back in 1994 when his father drove it off a lot for $14,000 and called it the best money he ever spent. The dealership doesn't call it a liability anymore. They don't call it anything but the Whalen rig, and they say it the way you'd say a name that's earned its way into the vocabulary of a place. Not with affection exactly, but with something close to respect, which in that country amounts to the same thing. The tractor has logged 1,140 hours on the transplanted engine since that October afternoon in the low 40, and it still works the home 80 every season, still starts every morning with the particular clatter that told his father's hands, once, that the day's work was ready to begin. The bell housing adapter the old welder cut by hand has never failed, never so much as loosened a bolt, though the old welder himself passed 2 winters back and never saw the training bulletin his fabrication ended up photographed for, laminated, filed away in a regional office as proof that ingenuity doesn't always come stamped with a part number. What the man at the fence line wants people to understand, if they're patient enough to listen past the numbers, the $71,400 quote, the $9,200 salvage price, the $16,000 total that beat it by more than 4-to-1, is that none of it was really about the money in the end. It was about a machine that carried 2 men's work in one frame, about a father's tractor refusing to die quietly in a barn, about proving that the ground doesn't care what color paint sits on the hood, only whether the thing pulling through it was built by someone who understood the mud, the debt, and the weight of what he stood to lose. The wheat comes up every year the same as it always has. The tractor keeps running, and that, he says, turning back toward the field, is inheritance enough.